All right, folks. Thank you all for coming out. It's the post-lunch lethargy. Is everyone feeling good? I mean, that music was pretty hyping. Let's get up. What? Yeah? All right. I know you guys are coming here to learn about the most controversial topic ever, which is Pwning phishing training. My name is Christian Dameff. Most people call me Quaddy at the summer cons. That's my handle. And I'm an associate professor of emergency medicine, biomedical informatics, and computer science at UCSD. And then I co-direct the Center for Healthcare Cybersecurity there as well.
Hi folks, my name is Ariana Mirian. I am a security researcher that focuses on the intersection of internet measurement and security. I currently work at Censys, and prior to this I was finishing my PhD where my thesis was on driving security decisions through internet measurement.
So we're going to, in the next 25 minutes or so, show you some work that we completed this year about a topic near and dear to all of our hearts. Here's the obligatory agenda slide. But the only thing I want to highlight from this is that we're starting off with talking a little bit about our motivations and the background for this, because I think it's important to set up a result that we weren't expecting to find. And then at the end, we're going to try to drive it home with a couple quick lessons and 2 recommendations that you can take back to your shop or ponder while you're going to bed tonight. But before we begin, I think it's important, we got to listen to some good music, we got to get the hype factor going on, but we also need to take an audience poll. I'm going to confess, these lights are incredibly bright, so I'm not even sure I'm going to be able to count, but I want to take a very scientific poll of the audience here. I want you to raise your hand if you think phishing training works. Raise your hand. Don't bicker with me about what works means and all that stuff. Raise your hand. Yeah, we're going to need a police escort after this talk. That was definitely a majority of folks.
Yeah, I think phishing training works.
All right. So for our background and motivation, again, not typically a very important part of a talk, but important for this one, because so many of you raised your hands. This is a nearly ubiquitous security practice. It is required for cybersecurity insurance. It is considered best practice. And it takes many forms. The 2 forms we're going to be talking about today are things like the annual cybersecurity awareness training. Now, you may do it at an increasing frequency. You might not do this, but for most parts, for compliance reasons, your users are at least getting an annual cybersecurity training. It's usually an online web module, something like that. And then the second type of phishing training we're going to talk about today are simulated phishing tests, also called embedded training. For folks that aren't aware of this, and I'm sure all you are, but think about the tests that your security folks at your organization send a simulated phish to the users. If the users fall for it, they click the link, they do something that they shouldn't have, then they're presented with some right then in their training, usually another web page that'll talk to them about why they shouldn't have done that and some tips and tricks for next time. So those are 2 types of training we're going to talk about. And then the idea, and then again, I'm not saying all of you think this, but a lot of our people think that this is teach them how to spot a phish and they can be trained for life, or let's build a legion of human firewalls at our organization. Just that concept in my brain, like build a legion of human firewalls is kind of scary when you think about what the visual picture that would be, but that's the idea. Equip your users and your organization to be more resilient to these types of social engineering attacks. So we're scientists, and we do these phishing simulations and trainings at our organization. And so the first thing scientists will do is they'll go and see if any other scientist has looked at this before. So really quick, a brief appraisal of all the science that's been done on this, that for the last 20 plus years of studies, the earlier studies showed some promise of this, that mostly in laboratory settings, you could teach people how to be better at identifying social engineering attacks like phishing. But these typically are how they went. You'd pull some grad students in, you'd give them a test about whether or not they could see some phishing, identify it, then you'd deliver them some training and you'd do an after. So think about these as kind of smaller scale laboratory tests. That was the majority of the literature. But then in the last 4 or so years, we've seen an increasing amount of data coming out, especially from real world experiments, like in real organizations, that cast doubt on whether or not this stuff actually works. So we had this problem, like what do we do? Like what do we take from this with these conflicting studies? So we wanted to do our own. And our initial motivation going into this was that we believed training worked. We just thought there was going to be some trainings that were better than others, that maybe it was the gamification element of it, whether or not the information was engaging, whatever it was going to be, that there was a training that worked, but we just needed to find the right one. And so when we talk about that, we're going to be talking about the different types of training you can deliver, and we're calling that modalities, okay? So these are examples from our study of 2 different types of phishing training you could give. When we say static, we are saying it's a page that just presents itself, gives some information, and doesn't, you don't have to do anything about it. Maybe you click an acknowledge button or something like that. When we say interactive, that's when you are forcing the user to click through various parts to highlight, don't look at who's sending it to you, et cetera, et cetera. That's what we're going to describe as interactive. And we wanted to treat our experiment kind of like what we do in medical research. So on the left side, if you want to bring a drug to market, if you want to be able to sell a drug in the United States, you have to go through years of studies, not just to come up with the idea, make the drug, but the first studies you have to do are in animals, and then you got to make sure it doesn't kill the animals. Then the second round of studies you have to do is make sure that you've got the dosing of it right and that it doesn't hurt humans. And then the last group of studies you do is to see if it even works. If you give this person a drug, it's actually going to do what you say it is, while also not killing them. And then at the end of that, you can then say, I want to sell this drug in the United States. The government goes, looks at all the data and says, yes or no, you can do that. What do we do in security? What do we do in cybersecurity as operators? We don't go through this rigorous process. We ship it. Right? And that's not always the case, but in a vast majority of the kind of practices that we employ, we don't have great evidence to support whether or not they work or not. And why is this bad? Because if medicine still did this, when you got a cold and you went to urgent care, the doctor might still try to take a pint of blood from you. Or if you had a sore throat, we might try to put some leeches on it or give you some mercury. That doesn't work. We have evidence to show that these treatments don't work, so we don't do those practices anymore. We've changed the culture of medicine to be more evidence-based. And our plea, and one of the action items of this, is how can we as security practitioners be more like the medical science when it comes to building an evidence base for what we do. So instead of spending millions of dollars and millions of hours, our users' time, our time, on ineffective solutions, how do we use science to actually identify what moves the needle? And so how did we go about doing that? No study is perfect, but what I want to briefly show you is this evidence pyramid, okay? So in medicine, we look at this as the hierarchy of evidence. The stuff on the top is the highest quality evidence. The stuff on the bottom is the lowest quality evidence. Now, when you have no evidence, it's fine to have some of the stuff at the bottom. Expert opinions, narrative reviews, case studies, et cetera. But the more you can do rigorous science to get to the top, the better. Where are we as security practitioners on this evidence-based pyramid? We're mostly in the bottom. We're case reports, case series, expert opinions. We get a majority of whether or not our products work from vendors that tell us with their kind of biased opinion on whether or not it works. We do not do things often like randomized controlled trials. And that's what we wanted to do. So our study design is a randomized controlled trial. What does that mean? The very first step we did is took 19,000 plus employees in our health organization. That's 3 hospitals, that's doctors, nurses, cafeteria folks, sanitation engineers, everyone that works to support a hospital. We have 19,000 plus employees. We randomized those into 5 groups. One group was the control group. They will get no training. We'll talk about that in a minute. We'll have generic static group. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Generic means, here's some general recommendations about how to avoid phishing. Hey, look at the sender, look at the headers, whatever it's going to be. Some general advice on how to avoid phishing attacks. Static means the page doesn't change much. The next group, generic interactive, still generic advice, but they move some boxes around, they click on some things. Then this is the difference in contextual. We had 2 groups that had contextual trainings. They took the phish that they just failed on, and that's what they used to teach them. So if they failed a message about, for instance, password resets, we used that password reset message to teach them about what they did wrong with the specific contextual message they received, okay? So we did this experiment over 8 months. We deployed monthly phishing tests, and to all 5 groups. If you were in one of the 4 groups that got training, when you failed and you clicked it, we provided the training that you were assigned to at group. If you were a control, when you failed a phishing simulation, when you clicked that link, you got a 404 page, you got no training. And this is also really important. If you don't have a control group, it's hard to make comparisons about whether or not things work. We made 10 different lures. These are the names of the lures. We'll show you a couple examples in a minute. And then we collected all sorts of metrics. What their failure rates were, what their training engagement was. Ariana's going to talk more about that. That was something really cool that we had to homebrew a little bit because it wasn't available in the standard vendor products. And then things like time since their last completed annual cybersecurity training and other things. Here's an example of one of the lures that we used it's just a standard. I'm sure you guys have probably even used this same one in your organization. It's a standard password reset lure. And now we're going to move on to the cool findings.
Great, thanks, Christian. So we're going to talk about the lessons learned and what it means for users and for the people in this room. The first, that was the wrong button. Great. First lesson that we learned is that we can pwn users with scientific lure crafting. Like Christian mentioned, we had 10 different lures that we deployed over these 8 months because we're not going to send the same lure over and over again. People, hopefully, would catch on and realize that they're just getting the same phish over and over again. So we wanted to keep it fresh. We wanted to show them a new lure every time. And when we were deploying these, we also measured the average failure rate. So how many people were clicking or falling for these phishing simulations? And we thought it would be mostly across the board, and it turns out we were incorrect. So this table shows the 10 different lures, the type that they are, which is the same as what Christian showed prior, the number of users that inevitably saw that lure, and the average failure rate for each of those phishing lures. So as you can see, the failure rate ranges anywhere from 1.8% to 30% of users. That is a huge range, right? This means that people who were getting the lure about their Outlook password getting hacked and they needed to reset it were not clicking on that email, again, hopefully because they were like, we know this, we've seen this, I know this is a phishing lure. 30% of people who saw that their vacation policy changed clicked on it. That's pretty reasonable, right? I would also click on a vacation policy change that was purporting to come from my institution. And so this is a wide range of failure rates, which was kind of surprising for us to see. And just to really drive the point home, it's not like the lures that had a higher failure rate had GIFs and images and flashing lights. This was the dress code violation one that had about a 27% failure rate. Like the one that Christian showed, it is just text. But the content of that text was enough to prompt very different user behaviors. So it's not like we were trying to game the system. It was just a slightly different text that spooked enough users that they clicked through to it. What this means for us is that whoever controls the lures controls the failure rate. Doing anyone? Maybe? Okay. If I was working in my security org and I was asked by my leadership to, hey, we want you to deploy a phishing simulation to show that our users are trained and that they are not clicking through, I might be inclined to send the Outlook password phishing lure, which is going to get a very, very low failure rate. Conversely, if my leadership says, hey, we want to make sure that everyone is getting trained, we want you to try and pwn the users as much as possible, I'm going to send the vacation policy or maybe even something that's more enticing to people. And so when large organizations are deploying phishing simulations, when they are deploying their own lures, it is important to have a variety so that you can see the difference in your own user population. If you just deploy one lure all the time, not only do people become accustomed to it, but it is not telling the whole story of how effective or not effective or how trained or not trained your user population is. We also see that on a long enough time frame, most people get pwned. So this graph shows the cumulative percentage of users that have at least one failure rate over time. And the way to read this is that by the time we get to 8 months, over 50% of users have clicked on at least one email. So give me a long enough time frame and give me some creative endeavors, and I can get the majority of the users to click on a phishing lure. And it's possible that, if we had continued this past 8 months, that would have topped out. We may not have gotten to 100%, but this graph does tell a story that over time, we can get a lot of people. We also need to stop punishing employees for failing their phishing tests. We keep hearing these stories as recently as last week of organizations that take the employees who fail a phish and then reprimand them, slap them on the wrist, even going so far as to suspending them or warning them of suspension. But as we saw, you can get anywhere from a 2 to 30% failure rate. And what am I going to do? At the end of 8 months, I'm going to suspend over 50% of UCSD health? That doesn't really make sense. So we really, really need to stop punishing employees for failing these phishing simulations, because this is hard stuff, folks, and it's not fair to them. The second thing that we learned, much to our dismay, again, this was just a journey for us, is that these trainings as deployed in these modalities are not efficacious, not as efficacious as we hoped, at least. And so I'll start with the annual cybersecurity training. So this, for us, it's like a 35 to 40-minute training. You do it once a year. It tells you to be, again, that human firewall. I really like that image. Yeah, exactly. We're going to link arms and be a human firewall. And so we were like, okay, well, people are taking this on a rolling basis. Surely, if you have just taken your annual cybersecurity training, you will be less likely to fail a phishing simulation because the information is fresh in your mind, you just took it, you've just been trained, you had 35 minutes of it, right? No. There's a lot happening in this graph, but the biggest thing that I want to take away for you folks is that this black line, which is the average percent of users who failed, remains very steady regardless of when a person gets a phishing simulation in relation to completing their annual cybersecurity training. We thought this graph would look a lot different. And so we are deducing that our annual cybersecurity training does not have a clear observable benefit to the user population. But like Christian said, we also had these embedded phishing simulations. We were sending people lures every month for 8 months, and some amount of them, 2 to 30%, were failing those lures. And so we're like, well, how about the embedded phishing simulations? Did that help people? And we found that there was an improvement, and the overall average improvement over the control for these monthly embedded trainings was 1.7%. And we also found that the overall average improvement over the control for our embedded trainings was 1.7%. And I'm just going to say it one more time in the back for the people in the back. The average improvement was only 1.7%. All of this time, effort, money resulted in a 1.7% decreased likelihood that you would be less likely to click on another phishing simulation. Again, this was incredibly shocking to us because we went in thinking, what's the best modality? And it turns out that it, on average, is just not efficacious in the way that we thought. So we're scientists, and we're like, let's dig into this more. Maybe we were looking at this in aggregate. Maybe if we look at subpopulations of the overall group, there are going to be some people who are doing better than others, and we can glean something from that, right? And the third lesson is that people don't spend time on anti-phishing trainings. And so this was actually a bit of a kerfuffle in our experiment design because we thought that the framework we would be using would surely have a built-in metric to tell us how long users were spending on the phishing trainings. And again, much to our dismay, it was just a lot of dismay in this project. They did not. And so we actually spent time hard coding metrics in the back end of this experiment to be able to record how long people were spending on the training, because we were like, this is important to know. Maybe it's that, the people who are spending 10 minutes are doing great, and the people who are spending less than 10 minutes are doing more poorly. And when I say people don't spend time on anti-phishing trainings, I mean they really don't spend time on anti-phishing trainings. So this first row is the percentage of people in each of those training groups that had sessions with 0 seconds. They effectively opened, it popped up, and they closed the tab so fast that we couldn't even even record a time for them. And that ranges anywhere from 40 to 50% of sessions. I also want to draw your eyes to the area that I circled. There's a bunch of percentiles here. I've highlighted the 50th percentile, which is a fancy way for us to say the median. Median users for these range of trainings, we're spending anywhere from 0 to 10 seconds. That's enough for training, right? People weren't spending time on the trainings. And so this gave a little bit more color as to why the average improvement was only 1.7%. So we're like, okay, great, let's take the admittedly small population of users that are spending more than 90 seconds, a minute and a half on this training, and let's see if the different modalities produce different outcomes. And so we analyzed those users, and again, found some really confusing results, which is that the people who spent time on static training over the course of the period did worse. There was a negative effect for them.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
There was a negative effect.
Oh my God.
But if you were lucky enough to get the interactive training, those people actually did do better. And the caveat here is that, again, because we're looking at subpopulations, the overall numbers are pretty small compared to the general experiment. So it's hard to say how much these generalize. This could be an entire experiment in and of itself. But it depended on what training you got. And so the solution, obviously, is for us to take everyone at UCSD Health and strap them to a chair and peel their eyes open for half a day and have them do their cybersecurity training, right? I'm gonna be like, hello, neurosurgeon, thank you so much for saving everyone's lives. I need you to just step away from all of that and do cybersecurity training, because how else am I gonna ensure that you have been trained unless we are peeling your eyes open? For those that don't know, this is from The Clockwork Orange, a fever dream of a movie. That's not the answer. We can't do that. People have jobs to do, right? And so this begs the question, is all of this focus on training worth the outcomes, this very small increase in outcomes? We know that we can pwn our users, given enough time and creativity, at varying rates. We know that over time, we can pwn the majority of users. And we also know that the people aren't even spending time on the training. And so here's the thing, is that we do believe we can find the right training. We get the cognitive scientists, we get the psychologists, we get the security researchers all in the same room. We can figure this out. And maybe it's that some populations would be better with one modality than the other. But how much time and effort and money will it take us? And how much of this would be erased with a slightly different lore, especially in the world of AI and LLMs? The asymmetry of security, the attacker versus the user base, is especially apparent here, because you just need one user to have a bad day and forget their training. An attacker can keep sending phishing emails. In other words, is the juice worth the squeeze, y'all? Is this where we should be putting our time? Or what if we put our energy and resources elsewhere? What if instead we spent time on training and deploying hardware YubiKeys, or trying to come up with more creative solutions, again in the world of AI and LLMs, such that we could look at folks' incoming emails and be able to more quickly extricate the phishing lures that end up in their inbox? What if we put the burden that is currently on the user more so on the system in creative ways? And is this worth the time and energy trade-off?
All right. Yeah, I'm seeing some really angry faces out there. We're going to have to watch our backs here. Harken back to what I mentioned earlier, empirically measuring these outcomes, sharing the data, analyzing it, using good scientific methods was the only way we were able to come across this finding. And with every scientist and every scientific method, or every scientific process should warn you that not one study should be definitive, or that this isn't their potential confounders or biases. But what we think with this data is that we have probably the world's best study on this. And it begs the question about what are we at? Is this closer to reality, that this stuff doesn't really work, or something else? We need to treat security research like medical research. Not in all of it taking 10 years to do or anything, but before we say ship it, we need to be able to ask ourselves, does it actually work? And are the people who are telling you it works, are they benefiting from selling you a product, right? Also, did someone else in the field take a look at it? Now, peer review science, it has its problems for sure, but it's the closest thing we have to an unbiased review of data and a real critical appraisal of whether or not something works or not. And it's just not something we do very often in cybersecurity. We need to be better. And with that is a call to action to you folks. Back up your claims with data. When people ask you for data, don't say, it's my secret sauce that I'm not going to share it with you. Maybe don't trust conflicted folks to be the collector, disseminator, and analyzer of your data about whether or not something works or not, and just say, just trust me at the end, it does. We're not asking all you folks to go back and take some statistical analysis works and classes and to have to do this all yourself. But if we as a group of folks can move towards this direction and make that data available in a safe and transparent way, there are plenty of folks with those skills who can answer some of these questions. And if we share the answers that we figured out with science with everybody, everyone can benefit. That's what we should be working towards. That's what happens in medicine. When a study gets published that says this drug is going to help this cancer, one hospital doesn't keep it to themselves. They share it with the world, and we need that. So in summary, we have 3 takeaways quickly and 2 recommendations. Lesson 1, it is easy to use science to figure out which lures are most effective, and you probably knew that already. But number 2, that the variance between 2% and 30% of your enterprise clicking on a single lure is not that much effort. It takes an LLM less than a second to take a 2% click-through rate lure and make it a 30% click-through and erase any benefit you would get from your training. Number 2, training as commonly deployed using off-the-shelf products that are quoted as industry-leading are not hugely efficacious. I mean, 1.7% aggregate training benefit, is that worth it? 3, maybe it's not efficacious because people just don't train. And what is it worth to make sure and force them into training, and whether or not that's juice worth the squeeze? Recommendation 1, let's find, using science, what works and what doesn't, and what we should all invest our limited budgets and time in, and then empirically analyze our security outcomes and share it and be open to criticism and evolution as we all try to advance together in defending our enterprises.
Okay, with our last time together, just to make sure, we need to know if we need to run out or not. How many people now think user phishing training works?
Oh my God. We should start a church. A cult.
We would be remiss if we did not say that good work is done with great people. And this was a collaboration with many fantastic people listed here. This is the peer-reviewed paper that was published at IEEE S&P earlier this year. And you can find the public free version on my webpage. If you're like, I want to know the details of your models, I want to dive into the statistics, there is a 13-page paper waiting for you with your name on it. And we've got 51 seconds. So with that, we want to say thank you, folks. We appreciate your time and energy. We can be found anywhere here online, and we'll also be in the wrap room after this to answer any questions. Thank you.